dynamic. And I'm going to try to maximize my PowerPoint here, and just let me know if it isn't working here. So let me just try to, just so that everybody can see this as good as possible here. I don't need the notes. So hopefully that's good for everyone.
Yeah, it's much bigger.
Is it? Perfect, perfect. And everyone will get a copy of the slides as well after the webinar, I believe, is my understanding. Now, let's go ahead and do a quick introduction here. Now, oops, hold on. I knew there was a reason I needed that. Okay, there it is. So let's just do a quick introduction. I appreciate everybody joining on this Tuesday afternoon here on the East Coast of Florida. I know some of you may be joining from in the US or overseas, wherever you may be. It's probably a different time zone, I would assume. And with that said, let's go ahead and do a quick intro. So I'm based out of Jacksonville, Florida. I've been last year and a half or so, I've been really working quite a bit with blockchain. And I've been a cloud architect since before it was actually cool to work with AWS. So if that's dating me, then so be it. We're like talking back in 2008 and 9, early on. I had the opportunity to work with the DoD integrator at the time on a beta FedRAMP test. It wasn't, FedRAMP didn't really come out until years later, but it was a sort of a play session in my opinion. So it's sort of cool. But anyway, so I've been working with AWS for a while. I'm also a AWS professional services partner, but I'm also very familiar with Google Cloud as well. It seems like it's a toss-up between what keeps me busier right now, to be very honest. And then before I got into cloud computing, I was doing a ton of data storage roles around Brocade, EMC, Hitachi data systems as well. Excuse me. So I've got a little bit of a cold here, so forgive me if I cough a little bit. I will try to minimize it, just be aware. Now, as far as my history, again, I've been in IT for since 1993 or so. So if that's dating myself, and that picture actually is pretty recent, it's about a year and a half ago. So I'm doing pretty good. So I feel pretty good. All right, so let's go ahead and get serious here. And let me go ahead and move my little keyboard here a little bit so I don't hit the wrong button again. Now, what I'd like to talk about is really DevOps. And what happened is apparently QuickStart and some of their technical leads, I guess, and again, decided it was a great idea to start splitting up a lot of specializations. And one of this is going to be DevOps. And there's a new website as well. I'm sure that'll be shared with you as well as my understanding. If it isn't yet, I'll leave that up to QuickStart to handle. But with that said, we're going to go ahead and kick it off with some, what I would call really decent training over 4 hours. Now, this training is generally going to be a one-day training generally, but we're going to do it in about 4 hours. And you'll come out with probably a lot more content than what we could cover in some of these sessions. This session here is fairly short per se. It'll be, you know, probably 55 minutes or so at the most, and time for questions. But when we get into, after we get through the basics of DevOps, we're going to get into basically services is really what we want to learn. So it's important for those folks that may not understand what DevOps is, or a lot of people know what DevOps is. It's pretty much, you know, one of the 3 top buzzwords that's out there, right? But basically, how do you implement it with AWS? So I'm going to talk about services that you're going to be using in AWS. And also, if you're already using AWS, great. You have a heads up. Your learning curve is not AWS. It's just going to be putting it all together. And what's really cool is AWS did their best to make things as easy to integrate as possible with some of your on-prem services. And I'll talk about your on-prem services because maybe you don't want to use, for example, Code Commit, Or GitHub, maybe you want to use GitHub instead and not code commit. Great. Or maybe code deploy. Maybe you would just want to use Jenkins or some other service. I'll talk about, whatever you're thinking to do. So there's ways to tie in third-party services and still use some of the AWS services as well. So you could create a pipeline, go ahead and deploy your instances. I had one customer talk about running CI and didn't want to go straight to a CD deployment right away. They just wanted to try things out with basically code commit, and they played around with code deploy. That's great, whatever works. And cloud formation. Now, for this seminar today, we're going to really just focus on the basics of DevOps and then some of the areas that are technical, but not too technical to where you will get lost, hopefully, if you don't have experience. So my goal is to work this into 4 sessions to where you're getting an 8-hour class for free. And again, I've taught courses on many different platforms. I'm pretty good at this stuff, and I'm really excited to be working with you. So for today, it's the basics overall, but I'm going to throw in and talk about each of the services in AWS at a high to mid level. I'm going to walk through a demo or two as well and show you, for example, cloud formation, code pipeline. And then next week, we're going to get into cloud formation. Cloud formation is a subject area in itself, and I really can't rush through it because if you don't understand cloud formation, infrastructure as a code, it's really hard to make the pipelines work. And we'll go ahead and get into CI and CD pipelines as well. Lastly, I'll talk about next week, I believe, is the last 2 sessions is my memory. But just be aware, we'll get into all of these areas, and I'm really excited to be doing that. So let's go ahead and kick it into high gear here. Now, let me get some water. Okay, sorry about that. Now, one of the things that I really want to make sure everybody gets out of this seminar, I call it a seminar, it's really a webinar, but again, I love to train and go out and speak as much as I can. So this is a great opportunity to share my knowledge and help some of you all out. So my goal here is to get folks to at least understand DevOps. And then I want to correlate DevOps to AWS. Now, I'm not going to make this a DevOps 101 course, even though I have a couple definitions I'm going to go through. I'm going to talk about how it works in AWS. I'm going to draw things out. I have some diagrams for you. You'll have the content. So if you need more resources, there's so many good resources out there. I absolutely will need to talk about automation tools as well. And another area that I'd like to cover, if time permits, which it should, is I just threw it in there as extra because this is one of the weak points that I see a lot of companies just forget to think about, and that's called DevSecOps. So I'll cover what that is and why it is so important. All right, let's talk about the concepts of DevOps. Now, the elementary term of DevOps is really development and operations, working together in one big happy family. And that's sort of the what I call the fantasy world, right? And the real data centers and the real enterprises, things are not normally that easy, right? In a lot of environments, development and operations are different entities. I've seen DevOps be set up to where it couldn't possibly work. For example, DevOps doesn't really work very well in a situation where you have follow the sun, for example. No one communicates with each other, or if they do, it's 16 hours behind sometimes or more. Doesn't mean it can't work. It's just that it takes a cultural shift and, some dedicated people to make it work. It's really hard to make that work sometimes in a situation like that. Now, the goal of DevOps is to help change and improve the relationship by better communication. Now, I remember the good old days of the tech boom and bust, okay? So I'm old enough to know what Silicon Valley was like back in 1998, 99, Boston, 96, and 97, you name it. So I remember how good the market was and how easy it was to just go from one role to another or get a higher offer. Those days are over. We know that. So this is why we're talking about DevOps. We need to get somewhere to your careers, get to a point in your careers so that you have an edge against your competitive opponent. And one of the things that I'm seeing right now is there's a lot of hype in DevOps, but the demand is not what they say it is. I just don't see it. And it's sort of like blockchain. There's demand, but it's not where it is. So my goal is I want everyone to get a holistic view, and I'm going to leave it up to you to figure out how it works in your organization. Some organizations are agile focused versus non-agile focused. Waterfall focused is another way to look at it, right? Again, there's a lot of things to cover. I'm going to talk about the 101 viewpoint right now. And if you have questions, feel free to speak up or chat up, whatever's available. All right, now there's some terms I'm going to talk about and some acronyms. Excuse me. Now, continuous integration, continuous delivery, and continuous deployments. These are very common acronyms that you are going to run into in AWS DevOps, Google DevOps, or on-prem DevOps, whatever you're doing, right? This is very common. You need to know what continuous deployment is, continuous integration. The goal, again, is not to read the definitions to you, but I want to give you some scenarios. So for example, in the next slide, again, I have the main technical definition here, and then I have a simpler one here that I call it the nutshell version. One of the things that, for me, I just don't like to work harder than I have to, okay? It's just human nature, right? I want to look at a word in a document, and I just want to get from point A to point B. And a lot of people are like that. So I hope this definition sort of clears up sort of the definition. If you have any more definitions you want to use, just feel free to go to like puppet.com. It has a great comparison as well. So let's where's my thing there? Okay. So let's take this step by step. So what is continuous integration? Well, continuous integration is essentially really the first step in getting the developer's working copies ready to be shared in a mainline. Now, another term for a mainline is called a pipeline. And in the world of AWS, we generally like to call it a pipeline. Continuous delivery is an extension of that. And this is an evolution, and an evolution is what? Basically, I like to call it a chain. You need to have your integration set up, your GitHub, your source code, right? You may need to have services like AWS Code Commit. You could also, if you so choose, some customers still use S3 for their source staging. So it's up to you on what you want to do. So think of continuous delivery, for example, as a way to primarily automate all the steps by submitting the code to the repository, which we're going to talk about, and then make sure it's tested and functional. And also, as part of this, we need to start talking about a manual process versus an automated process, which I'm going to cover a little bit later. I just don't want to get too ahead of myself. Now, one of the things to think about is generally, too, when we think about extending a CD pipeline, we want to make sure our software build, for example, will deploy if it passes all the tests, right? So we need to make sure that automation is part of this, and we like to call this part of what's called the continuous deployment phase, for example. Now, there is some other terms I'm going to talk about quickly. I'd like to get into some demos and walk you through how to basically use CloudFormation real briefly. I'm going to cover CloudFormation, though, much deeper on Thursday. This is more like a 5-minute discussion, and then I'll get into EC2 or S3, for example, Code Commit, and I'll talk about that. So there's a lot to cover. We still have another 20-something slides to go through, so there's a lot of content to cover. Now, Now, one of the things that I like to sort of cover from a business perspective is DevOps is not just a technical process. It has to be a business process. You have to have the business buy-in, because we all know that the technical leads generally don't make all the decisions. It's the business folks. So we need to appreciate that we have to get the buy-in from the organization. So a lot of that comes down to what? Do we have the culture? Do we have the processes, the people, the technologies in place to go ahead and deploy DevOps? We need processes. For example, if you don't have processes for Agile, for example, then probably going straight to DevOps isn't going to work really well. And if you don't have any development best practices in place, it's going to be an interesting place to work. I'll just leave it at that. So you need the business to buy in. So you need some governance, in my opinion, is the way I like to look at it. Automation needs to be firm. It needs to be tested. It needs to be funded. There's just so much to talk about when it comes to, for example, other areas of DevOps, like the functionality, or what's called the functional areas, for example, and the risks and everything. I won't cover all of those. We want to just focus mainly on how to do this in AWS. But if you have questions, feel free to speak up, and be happy to answer them. All right, now, when we talk about people, once again, we have to have not only a culture of working together, we need to have people willing to do the work. I've been in great organizations that you see, like on Twitter and what is that, LinkedIn, right? I mean, they're pumping out all kinds of stuff. We like this, we're doing that. And then you go into, I can't mention names, but if you go into some of these companies, the development and operations don't even communicate half the time. It's only like, we need you to do this after we escalate it to the CIO. So that's not a good culture and people to work with if that's how they behave. If they have mainframes, run away. Don't even, just go do something else, because, I got some stories there, but I'll leave it at that. So what I'm trying to get at here is, I'm just trying to put humor to this. DevOps only works when everything can come together. So we call that the 4 axes. Lastly, you need technology, and technology generally requires what? Expertise, right? And that expertise costs what? Money. And that money comes out of what? It comes out of the organizations, one way or another, right? Some companies invest in their organizations, and some companies just do not. They just buy back shares, right? That's generally the what we're seeing nowadays. That's what I see as a very visible consultant and author. It's just something you have to acknowledge. And I know each of you can't control your situations, maybe the way you like, but you have to be cognizant, is sort of the way I look at it. Okay, so enough of the business side. What I'd like to do is just sort of sum up a few things. And some of this is probably very obvious, but again, I touched on this. So we need to do what? We have to employ continuous deployment, for example, for us to benefit as an organization or an enterprise. Because if we have continuous deployment, what is that? It's automation. The users are saying, hey, they're yelling at us, right? The users are basically upset, whatever the discussion is. So for example, if a user can't log in because he made a change, how does that get back to development to fix? Is it through the help desk? Is it through 7 emails? Is it through a Twitter post? I mean, yes, I've seen that before. So again, not exactly ideal. So just be aware. Automation, automate, automate, automate. Now, I like to speak of automation as a way to keep your job. It's not a way to get rid of your job, because there's a lot of discussion about AI. AI and automation are really 2 different things. And to be honest, AI is nothing but what? It's code, it's scripting, it's some logic. It's the same darn thing we've been doing for what, 30 years or so for us that know mainframes, right? And what I'm trying to get at is don't make it difficult. There's nothing really to get too stressed out over because, again, a lot of the tools are already there. And in AWS, they really make things easy for you. And if you're using other solutions on-prem, you could simply just extend it to AWS. Again, that support's generally there. I've not seen too many tools not supported by AWS. Now, other cloud providers could be a different story, but with AWS, generally they're covered. Lastly, the last thing I want to talk about is you as the DevOps guru in your organization, the cloud architect or whatever your title is, you want to automate to make yourself provide value. That's the goal. Don't try to get your job out. You want to just provide value. That's really, because when I go and I have discussions or teach class, some people get really scared when they hear automate because all we're hearing now is what? Blockchain, AI, all these other terms that are out there, predictive learning, machine learning, right? So don't think of it because CloudFormation does not fit that at all. Okay. All right, so let's talk about why we want to use DevOps in AWS. Well, we know, one sec. Okay. Once again, we know AWS. I'm not here to sell you AWS or DevOps. I'm here just to tell you the technical merits and why a lot of companies use AWS. Now, generally, they have really great automation. It's already there. There's marketplace solutions. Jenkins, you name it, whatever you want to use is there. And I'll go through what is actually supported during the next 2 or 3 classes as well I think that's the last class, the integration. So I'll cover a lot of the tool sets that you may already be using, for example, right? Now, again, Maven, whatever, CodeShip, I don't know, whatever you're using, right? Now, where'd my mouse go? Let me put it there. Oh, I moved it. There it is. Okay. So once again, DevOps is really bringing value. That's what I want you to get out of this. Now, this is actually from AWS. If you go to AWS's DevOps website, this is their diagram. This is sort of their viewpoint of how you as a customer can transform with AWS and DevOps. And I'm going to talk about the services that are going to really enable you to shine. So let's go ahead and start getting into this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you sort of like some tidbits. I'm going to expand on these tidbits. Then I'm going to talk about each of the services we're going to cover in the class. And then I want to get to some demos and walk you through some of the features and functions of some of the tools. Once again, it's not a deep dive into all the tools. It's more of just to show you where you can go with it. And then go through some diagrams and make sure we have some time for questions. All right, so there's a lot of great stuff to cover here. When we think of AWS, a lot of customers automatically think of what services? EC2, right? Elastic Beanstalk, Lambda, ECS, right? All of those services you could certainly tie in to your basically architecture for DevOps, whether or not it's fully in AWS or not. Once again, a lot of customers prefer a private GitHub than keeping it on GitHub. They may want to use CodeShip or they may want to use other tools that are out there. I have one customer not so much using GitHub, but using like Jira, for example, or Slack even. So it's all about what you want to do, right? Now, let me just cover. Okay. And so we know these services, right? I'm going to go through some demos and I'm going to walk you through CloudFormation here shortly, but we want to just make sure we know some of these services. So I'll talk about these before we get into the demo so that it'll make sense to you when I go through some of these. Okay. Now, we want to think of AWS Developer Tools as a set of services that are really designed to enable developers. Now, can operations folks use the tools? Sure. But DevOps is really what? It's a team effort. Developers will probably be using GitHub. And on the other hand, CloudFormation will probably be used by the operation folks. And it's all about the roles in the organization, right? Once again, as a solutions architect, and if anyone here took the solutions architect exam, whether it's the first one or one of the recent versions of it, right? You know a lot of these tools already. So there's probably not much new here. But what we want to get to the folks that may not be aware is that some of the tools we're going to talk about are developer focused and some are going to be ops focused. And then we're going to put it all together and make sure that we know how to make things work from a technical perspective. And also, before I close out, I want to go through the business side again and make sure you have the right message. So what is CloudFormation? CloudFormation is an amazing tool. And I'm not here to sell it. It's free. No one makes money on it, but probably AWS when you spin it up and forget to turn down EC2. That's another story, right? But what I'm getting at is it's really a tool everyone should be using if you're deploying enterprise level cloud services. Now, that's with AWS, right? Now, if you already have an on-prem solution, do you need to go to CloudFormation right now? No. Stay wherever you're at. Again, there's plenty of great services that do almost the same thing. The main difference, and I'll talk about this more in the integration part of the course, is again, it's really about what's supported, JSON versions, YAML files. Some customers use JavaScript. It all depends on the tool that you're using. So again, you want CloudFormation to basically define your template. And you want to write it typically in YAML format, and we'll show you how that works and talk more about it as well. You can have different tools as well, whatever you feel like. It's really up to you. Now, some customers like to generate on-prem templates and then import that over to cloud storage, for example, if that's what works for your organization. Again, there's so many options. Now, CloudFormation, we want to think about it as infrastructure as code. Basically, this is another buzzword, basically, where provisioning is automated and managed, basically. And that's really the buzzword in the industry right now. Another term you may have heard of, you may not. But basically, we want to think about CloudFormation as a way to roll out on a templated basis our basically structures and our services in a controlled manner. And I'll talk more about how that would be done. Now, let's see. When we talk about code pipeline, so what is code pipeline? Well, code pipeline, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And let me just do a quick demo before I don't have my screen up, so forgive me if I don't remember exactly where we're. Okay, so let me go ahead and wrap up this, then I'll go to the demo. Okay, I just want to make sure I was still where I thought I was. And lastly, again, if we want a repository, we could use GitHub, Code Commit, Jira, Bitbucket, whatever is chosen by our organization. Again, whatever makes sense. So there's no strict limits on how you, start your pipeline. Everything really should work if you're following the basic templates and structure. Okay, let's talk about automation tools. Now we're going to go ahead and talk about these tools here. What I'd like to point out is, let me go ahead and go to insert here. And I think it would be good to just draw it out. Well, I guess I could, I'll just put an arrow there. It's probably simple enough. Okay. So again, we have, and I think everybody, let me just move my mic, it fell down. Okay. So I think everybody should be able to see this. So over here, we have what? This is our development, right? And then on the left, and then on the right is generally what? This is our operations. And again, this is going to be what? GitHub, right? Our other services like Code Pipeline, Code Build. And then over here, we'll have, for example, CloudFormation. We'll have monitoring, could be CloudWatch or whatever we're using on-prem. Operate could be any number of tools as well, right? OpsWorks, so on and so on. So we have a lot of good options here. So think of, and this is a very common, what I call diagram out there. So it's all over the place. You always see it. So when you look at the diagram, just think of the left as basically development and the right as operations. It's that simple. So blue and basically orange. And we're going to cover this a little bit more in a different way so that we all get it. Okay. Now, let's talk about CloudFormation. Now, CloudFormation is one of those tools that you have to learn. You can't really perform DevOps without CloudFormation. You could, but it probably, you know, again, you could, but it wouldn't be as efficient. That's just my take. So it's really up to you. CloudFormation is a really good tool. It's like if you're using Google Cloud, you're going to want to use Deployment Manager. Do you need to use those? No, it's really up to you. But it makes your life easier. Why do we want to use CloudFormation? First of all, it's free. So again, if we're only using our services in AWS, CloudFormation's a no-brainer. However, what about if we're using other tools on-prem? Well, maybe CloudFormation might not make sense, right? So it's all about the use case. So again, if you're going to deploy only to AWS, CloudFormation is, you know, really where you should go. On the other hand, if you're going to deploy a hybrid cloud to Google Azure and on-prem, then go ahead and stick to, you know, whatever you feel like, right? Maybe CodeShip or, you know, other tools that are making sense. I had a customer that was using, by CloudBees Jenkins. It used to be known as Hudson. But anyway, so when they said Hudson, it brought back memories. So it's like, what, Hudson? What is that? Oh, yeah, I forgot. Yeah. So anyways, we get the point, right? So it's all about the use case. Now, here's an example of how CloudFormation works. Now, what I'd like to do, and again, you have the diagram. We're going to do a whiteboard and go to the demo. How are we doing on time? I've got 4:38. All right, so we're doing good on time. I just want to make sure I cover everything and get to questions as well. Now, what I'd like to point out here is when we think of CloudFormation, and if you don't get this today, it's okay. We're going to cover it again before we get deeper into CloudFormation next week, or actually on Thursday, I should say. I think Thursday is the next day. So again, we'll cover this more, but I want to cover this at a high level just so that we have an idea. So we have to create what's called a stack in essentially CloudFormation. Well, basically a stack is going to be, I like to call it a workflow. Again, it's basically how does this roll out? It's templates are different. So I'll get into some of the terminology next week more in detail. But basically what we want to do is create a CloudFormation stack, launch EC2, for example, and then so let's say we want to deploy EC2 and we have an app running on EC2. What we do first is what? And I think I have the instructions right here. I put it in right here. So for those that want to follow along, this is pretty much what we're going to do. Basically, we're going to go ahead and do what? We're going to go ahead and create the stack. We're going to deploy the templates. And let me get that out of the way. We're going to go ahead and launch EC2. And why do we want a template and create a stack? Well, because we want to make sure that we're deploying all the right revisions and source code and configuration variables that we need, right? And then it's going to go ahead and look at the user data and the metadata and kick off what's called CFN-init. This is basically, I like to call this sort of like a daemon for those Unix folks or a service for Windows folks. Basically, it's going to kick it off. And then it'll go ahead and configure the instance. This is part of the automation process. We'll go a little bit deeper into this next Thursday or this Thursday, so just be aware. Now, For those folks familiar with GCP, again, here's some comparable services. I won't cover those. I just threw it in there just in case we have some Google experts, so you could just correlate nice and easy. Now, how does this all work? Again, I won't spell it out to you. Again, it's fairly straightforward, right? We're going to cover that more in detail. It's there in case you want to know it. Okay, let's talk about some of the services we're going to cover over the next 3 classes. The first, after CloudFormation, is going to be code commit, code build. So what is code commit? We need to have version control, right? We want to be able to deploy our services and have a repository. If we don't use GitHub, we don't want to go out to the network and pull our source code. Code commit is essentially GitHub on AWS. Again, it's pretty simple, straightforward to set up. You go ahead and fork over your GitHub if you want, pull it in, whatever you want to do. It's very straightforward to use. Now, code build. This is a fully managed build service, that is. And fully managed means what? AWS is handling all the containers and the availability on the back end. You don't have to worry about that. So again, managed service is a little bit more hands-off. You still can manage a little bit, but it's not like, to be honest, a lot of these services in AWS are a little bit harder to customize than they are in Google. So it's a little bit more stricter in AWS, but you can still get it done. So code build, think of it as a managed build service. So if we're not using any on-prem service, then use AWS code build. Again, we're only really paying for what? We're paying for the resources we're using in our code commit, our bandwidth, whatever. We're not really paying for any of these services directly in most cases. Now, code deploy, what exactly is that? Now, one of the things I'm going to point out is I have some diagrams here just so you could see. And again, I didn't want to put in the diagram 3 or 4 times or, draw it all out per se, but I want to put it in there just so you could put it together. So you could see, like, we're going to have our source, our build and test will be on code build, deploy could be on code deploy, right? And this is called an AWS code pipeline. So this is what? This is our development part of the world, right? And then the blue section is what? This is, again, our operations. Operations is going to probably manage EBS, ops work, CloudFormation, CloudWatch generally. Now I've seen some companies where developers can do it all, ops can do it all. And trust me, there's plenty of those roles if you want to do everything. Now, what we want to realize too is a pipeline is a main line for us old folks, if you've been in the business a while. So think of a main line as nothing but a pipeline. It's a workflow is another way I like to sort of talk about it. So try not to make the terms more complex than they are. And it's all centralized. So what's really cool too is and I'm going to go to the demo here right now. I think that was it. And what we want to do is I want to talk about a couple services. I just want to walk you through how CloudFormation's formatted and how you could figure out what's running and just take a quick look. I only deployed a couple services. I didn't deploy a lot of services yet. We'll get into the demo part and you'll have instructions to do it if you want to go back and do it on your own as well. So that'll be for later in the class. All right, so let's talk about the tools. Now, if we go to AWS services, we know the layout, right? Most of us probably have been working at AWS. Excuse me, I think my voice is going to go here. I'm glad. Okay. Okay, now, one of the things to realize is if you've already been working with AWS, this is all, again, pretty straightforward. But if you haven't, you want to typically go over here to management and governance to start looking at some of the services that you may want to consider. For example, we're going to be talking about CloudFormation. We'll talk about some of the other services, such as CloudWatch, perhaps as part of the integration. And then we'll be, of course, talking about EC2. And then if I have time, I'm happy to talk about serverless and microservices as well. Now, some customers like to use S3, and I'll show you how that works. Again, fairly straightforward, but what we want to do is, again, go down here and just look at the services if we're new. So, or what we could do is just go up here, right? Again, type in whatever we want to use. So if we want to go to code build or code commit or code deploy or CodeStar, we could select any of these. So let's go to CloudFormation first. Now, I'm going to give it a second because there might be a little latency. I know that sometimes when I change the Cloud Console screen, there may be a little latency. I'll give it about 30 seconds. Okay, so I have basically what's called a couple stacks that are already deployed. And one of them is nested. And I'll talk about what that really means next week. But basically, I deployed one of the blockchain templates. And again, it's really easy to deploy some of these services with CloudFormation. So I just go over here and I could go ahead and create a new stack. I could use what's called a design template. So what is a design template? Well, let's go take a look, right? AWS has really tried to make things a lot easier. And we have a choice here. We could use our template language in JSON or YAML, and it'll convert it automatically for you next week. I'll go through this actually next class or early next week, depending on time. So again, CloudFormation is really a whole class in itself. So what we want to do now is I want to go back and I go over here. So let's go ahead and look at a deployed app. So if I go over here to blockchain book, you could see that I have my CloudFormation. It has what's called the stack ID, the stack name, the status is create complete. So that's good, right? So that means that it completed. If it didn't complete, then that wouldn't be good. And it tells me information on that. But what I want to do is I go over here to events and I could go look at, for example, the template. So if I want, I could just go over here and copy the template. Generally, what I recommend for people learning anything with CloudFormation or anything with YAML or anything that's really new to you and you're not a developer, just copy the code. There's plenty of examples out there on GitHub for free. You don't have to have a license. It's there. It's open domain, right? Go ahead and use it. So you copy this and play around with it and see how things can work. But basically, if I go over here to outputs, I select the basically the port 8080 for my blockchain app. And so what I did is I simply deployed a blockchain app, and it took literally no more than, well, let me clarify. There's a lot of work to get ready to deploy a CloudFormation template. IAM, security groups, right? A lot of things, permissions, ACL. So there's a lot of security stuff we have to do. So it's not exactly a walk in the park for someone new. And if anyone's interested, go to my Medium page. I have a step-by-step instruction on how to deploy Hyperledger, for example, with CloudFormation. So that's really the cool part. Okay, so I go over here, look at blocks per minute, transactions. So I basically have a mini blockchain. Basically, I have what's 3 peers here, and I have block activity as well. And if I go to transactions, you can see that I have that there. Network is there in dashboard. So again, so this is how CloudFormation can work. So I'll go ahead and get out of there. We're not really here to talk too much about that. I just want to show you how easy it is to find out what you just deployed. Now, let's go back to the diagram here. So what we want to do now, how are we doing on time? We got 4:50. So what I want to do, actually, before I forget, let's go back to AWS and let's go to code pipeline. Now, what I'm going to do, I believe for time purposes, we'll probably not get to this until next Tuesday. However, if you sign up, you'll have all the instructions and the slides and the video. What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through first how to basically set up a code pipeline in AWS. It's remarkably easy. So the first thing we want to do is source. What is source, right? We want to tell basically code pipeline, where is our source code? Are we going to pull it from AWS? Are we going to go to off-prem? What are we going to do? We have to point it to the repository, right? So again, if I have a pipeline set up, I would just go ahead and select it, but I go over here to create a pipeline and I just put in a name, right? And I'm gonna call it QuickStart test. And again, very simple. And I want to create a new role and then I want to name it, whatever makes sense. Generally, when I name a role, I like to be very specific because one of the challenges is you're going to want to create tags when you scale your enterprise out. Because the last thing we want to do is deploy a service and not even know what department or contact deployed the service without having to go through a bunch of logs and spending time, right? We want to identify it easy. So name it appropriately so you can find it. We could select a default location or a custom location. So I could point it to S3, and I'll walk you through some of the options next week. And again, default location, so I can go next. Now, it's going to ask me here, what is my source provider? What are my choices? I have AWS Code Commit. Now, I want to use Code Commit if I'm not using anything on-prem, I'm not using anything in the cloud, and I just want to deploy things as easily and as managed as I can. So Code Commit can work. And I'll talk about some of the pros and cons. But again, the main reason is, do you have an on-prem or other cloud solution or do you not? If you're using GitHub, perfectly reasonable to use GitHub. I'll walk you through how to connect up to GitHub as well. And we'll go through all that. But I can also go over here and select ECR or Code Commit. And if I select Code Commit, I have to select a name. So what do I want to do? I have to go over to Code Commit and start configuring stuff, right? I want to plan this appropriately. And I could also check over here, detection options. This is basically saying when I choose to start my pipeline, do I want to detect if there's a change in the source code or not? Why do we want to change, why do we want to detect changes? What about if developers make a change, right? And we start the pipeline and we don't roll out the proper code and it's not automated. I've seen many companies roll out bad code because, again, they just didn't communicate or document, plan appropriately. And again, AWS is sort of putting it in your face here saying, do you want to detect the change or do you not? It's up to you. You get tied into CloudWatch, which is their default approach. Now, some customers don't use CloudWatch. So if you're not using CloudWatch, use Code Pipeline and you could tie in, for example, Nagios or whatever you may be using on-prem. It's going to take a little work, but you could do it. And again, you'll set up your name and everything like that. So I'll walk through this for everyone before we go through all the services. So basically, I just wanted to point that out. So this is a pipeline, right? Very simple. Pick our source, pick our build, deploy, and then pipeline. And we'll go through this step by step during the course. So let's go back to developer tools. Now, I'm going to recommend, if you haven't deployed any of these tools, go to this page. What's really cool is if you're an AWS partner, you have a lot of free training available to you, or just ask your AWS partner to provide some more training if they can. Again, they may be able to give you some credits. I don't know everyone's relationship with AWS, but there's definitely a lot of things to consider here. All right, so let's see. Is there any questions on anything before we wrap up?
So there's a career-related question that I got.
Sure.
Is a cloud engineer or a systems engineer the same as a DevOps engineer?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And here's my thought. It all depends on the company. Now, there's a lot of roles that are very specific to DevOps. In other words, you're going to have a development background. You're going to typically be required to have some kind of tool set experience, like Jenkins, for example, maybe CodeWatch or CodeShip, I should say, whatever the situation is. But I've seen other companies that do expect you to handle all of this. In other words, this whole stack. In other words, you'll need to deploy code. You'll have to test it out. You'll have to provision and monitor it all at once. So the roles in the cloud, so a great question in the career world. I don't really have a good answer because it's all over the map. There is no right answer because it just depends on where you're located, who you work for. If you work for a large enterprise, you're probably going to specialize more. If you work for a smaller enterprise, like let's say under, 1,000, 1,500 people, you're probably going to be one of 2 or 3 people that are going to manage the cloud and do everything on the cloud. On the other hand, if you're a multinational company with a whole cloud team, you're going to specialize more. So I hope that answered the question.
Yep, it does. Okay, thank you, Joseph. Thank you, guys, for attending. This was part 1 of a 4-part series. We'll reach out to you with information about the second part very soon. I think the next email goes out on Monday. And have a nice day, everyone. Thank you, Joseph, for doing this. We'll see you next time.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
You'll have to end the meeting. Yeah, you'll have to end the meeting.
Do that right now. Okay, great. And all right, so we'll go ahead and terminate. Thank you again.
Okay, bye.
Yep, bye.